this responsibility to be aware and to develop and grow, it's not just a resident or a fellow, but it's a faculty responsibility also.
Welcome back to Pediatrics. I'm Zach Hodges.
And I'm Alice Shanklin. Today, we're talking about emotional intelligence. I know what you're thinking. Emotional intelligence, it's not just for family meetings, and it's not just something you're born with. We've got a guest who's building a faculty and fellow program and really hoping that this is a key area of growth for his people.
That's right. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen Loscalzo. Dr. Loscalzo is an attending physician in the Division of Pediatric Critical Care Medicine and an Assistant Professor of Anesthesiology, Critical Care, and Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine in the University of Pennsylvania. He earned his medical doctorate at Drexel University College of Medicine and was a resident and chief resident in pediatrics at St. Christopher's Hospital for Children. He did his critical care fellowship at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where he stayed on as faculty.
Yes. And we would like to thank Dr. Elorm Avakame for joining us today and for recruiting this guest. Elorm is originally from Philly as well. He went to Harvard Medical School where he got his MD and a master's in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Elorm then joined me for Peds residency in DC. While we're recording this, he's a fellow at Columbia, but he will be graduating soon.
Yes. What a great conversation. Not the same as our typical bread and butter of sepsis and shock and ARDS, but a very important topic. Let's get right to the conversation.
Dr. Stephen Loscalzo, thank you so much for joining us today on Peds Crit. We've already read your formal introduction, but how would you describe yourself?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited to be here. I am a Philadelphia native. I am like a bleed Philadelphia Eagles green. Grew up here for high school, went to college not too far. Med school, residency, fellowship have all been here, and I am still here in what I think is the best city on the 95 corridor. Sorry, guys. I know, shots fired early. And I think the other important thing to know about me is I have 4 kids at home, all less than 7. So my life oscillates from crazy within the walls of the hospital to crazy on the outside of the hospital, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
Well, we are so impressed, especially with that context, that you are here. Dr. Elorm Avakame, can you introduce yourself to our listeners as well?
I would love to, Alice. And just like Dr. Loscalzo, one of the first things to understand about me is that I, too, am a Philadelphia native. I, too, bleed Eagles green. You know, Philly is one of those hometowns where it's less of a hometown and more of a religion. So in addition to whatever other faith you may or may not practice, we practice the faith of Philadelphia. And so we take that very seriously. We wear that on our sleeve, and that has to be a part of any introduction.
So great. So, as a Georgia Bulldog, I like to think that our past defense now lives in Philadelphia. Connection there.
We're happy for that.
That's right. Great topic today, emotional intelligence. As I kind of reflect on our journey here, we really have a history of talking about the bread and butter physiologic approach, sepsis, respiratory failure. Emotional intelligence, though, is something that's really important, and it really affects almost everything that we do at the bedside. Well, I'd love to know, Steve, how did you get interested in this concept of emotional intelligence, and tell us how you recognize the need for that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say I've always taken a lot of value, both for myself and those around me, in education. And I have loved teaching about physiology, about sepsis. I'm someone who, I have a marker in my hand, I'm writing on the doors, I'm supposed to erase it after. That is part of who I am when I am on the unit. And what I realize is that, we spend so much time talking about physiology, basic sciences, medical decision making. And then there's this huge other part of our practice as physicians, which is interacting with those around us, with our colleagues, with families, with other members of the medical system, even outside of the medical system, if you're someone who's advocating for change in different ways. So the more I reflected on that, I realized, hey, we get exposed to this, but are we really getting prepared to do what we need to do in the jobs that we're in?
For sure. Every conversation that we have in the ICU can be emotionally charged. These are life and death situations. Our families are in uncomfortable scenarios. Having that aptitude of emotional intelligence is so incredibly important.
So what is emotional intelligence? Can you help us develop a working definition, or what are some conceptual frameworks that we might be able to use to ground this discussion?
I frequently, when I talk to people about emotional intelligence, we do some word association. And inevitably, the first word that comes out is empathy. And empathy is incredibly important. It is a valuable trait and behavior within emotional intelligence, but it's really so much more than that. So there's several frameworks out there. The framework that I've kind of gravitated to is one by someone named Daniel Goleman, who's an American psychologist and tremendous academic. And really, emotional intelligence, kind of summatively, it's our capacity for recognizing our own and others' feelings, and then for managing emotions effectively, including motivating ourselves and others. It's kind of a wordy, complex definition, but more practically, it's the idea that emotions can impact behavior, both positively and negatively. And if you learn to both recognize and regulate emotions, you can be a more influential leader and team member in these complex environments. Think Yoda, but with more proper sense and structure.
Oh, that's beautiful. And I think it's about regulation, how you motivate a team. It's so much more than just recognizing and responding. For those of us who aren't that familiar with how this is really described in research, can you give us some concrete examples or concrete actions that fall under the umbrella of emotional intelligence?
Yeah, so I think we can elaborate on the descriptions of emotional intelligence. It can be classified out into kind of 4 major domains: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. Like you mentioned, parts of that are reflective towards yourself and what you are doing, what you are seeing, and what you are experiencing. And then part of that is what's happening around you. Understanding and reading the face and the body language and the tone and the intonation of those who you are communicating with. These are all incredibly important pieces that come together to make up the totality that is emotional intelligence.
So I feel like emotional intelligence is something that we wish we were born with. But unfortunately, I'll speak for myself. I mean, I certainly am not. And I always wish that I could, as you kind of mentioned, like read the room or understand people's perspective. Maybe it's unsaid. What are some specific behaviors that you feel like we can implement or to give us maybe insight into what's going on in those around us to get a start in what might be described as emotional intelligence?
This comes up a lot when you talk about emotional intelligence, and people are like, well, that's not my personality. That's not who I am. And I challenge it to say, personality absolutely impacts emotional intelligence, but it doesn't dictate it, okay? You can be an introvert, for example, and have emotional intelligence. You can be an extrovert and have emotional intelligence. And you could have any of these other kind of personalities and still be able to flex into periods where you're using this to interpret. Let's pretend it is midnight in December. You're in the hospital. It's RSV season. That might be right now. Fortunately, there's not there's some flu, but not too many other viruses at the moment. And, busy night, busy unit, and you are going on your 5th rapid response off the unit. And you are going to the observation unit to see a patient who has been in the hospital for 30 minutes and who is on high flow nasal cannula, 21%. So I ask you, when I describe that scenario to you, what's your initial response to that?
I think you really hit the nail on the head with this one. This is emotional control.
You might be frustrated. You're like, oh my gosh, here we go again. Why do they need me? What's going on? Your competing interests going on. But there's steps that need to happen next, right? So let's think about that scenario a little bit more and how it relates to emotional intelligence. So you, as you just said, Alice, you gotta calm yourself a little bit. And there's some self-regulation and other pieces come into it. But then you get down there and there's other things that you're responsible for, not just as the clinician, not just as the evaluator of critical illness. Does this child need more support? But what's going on? Why are people concerned? What are they worried about? What else is going on in the room? Is there heightened tensions with the family? Is there other acuity on that unit? Is there a relatively junior bedside nurse, relatively junior provider? All of these things that if you don't take the time to explore and make sure you understand, it may lead you to make the right clinical decision for the individual patient in front of you, but you might fail on a systems level. And emotional intelligence plays a huge role in gathering all of the information that you need to make the best decisions in scenarios.
So I can easily see this scenario as something that we do on a daily basis, going down to the regular ward, pediatric ward, for rapid response, and reflecting on my training, becoming increasingly aware of the things that go unsaid. Maybe it's the nurse that feels uncomfortable. Maybe it's the family member who doesn't quite understand the trajectory of their child's illness. Going in with an open mind, asking everyone in the care team and the family, what's worrying you, what's concerning you. Would love to know more about your thoughts on this specific scenario. What are some practices when we go down to our next rapid response? How can we practice emotional intelligence at the bedside there?
Yeah, so I'm going to explore the idea of self-awareness. So you go down there, and Zach, you are a senior critical care fellow on call in the unit. That's your title. That's your designation. You understand your role and your responsibility. But how do others see you? Do they see you as someone who is coming to help? Do they see you as the gatekeeper to other care that they need? Do they see you as someone who's going to be a roadblock to what they need? Are they someone that they're happy that they're there? They're upset that they called? There's a lot of exploration about how others see us. And an exercise that I do with our fellows is kind of blocking out this idea of self-awareness as both an internal component and an external component, and that you have to have modulation of both of those. You have to understand how you see yourself, and you have to be able to see how others see you. And so one of the behaviors that can really support that is a little bit of what I heard when I described the scenario, which is that that exhale was actually a moment of self-regulation and a moment of centering where at least you're starting to create the space to listen. That is one of these really key behaviors that undermines a lot of effective communication that falls under emotional intelligence, which is you have to be able to create the space. I talk with people about, we mentioned empathy being a word that's associated with emotional intelligence a lot. And empathy, people think about kindness and caring and those type of descriptors with it. But empathy is actually connection. It's finding a way to connect with someone in front of you on whatever wavelength that is. It could be a positive one, it could be a negative one. But then from empathy, from that connection, then you can build. Then you can add compassion. Then you can add action. But it starts with creating that space, and I think that's where you can practice and develop that skill.
I love this conversation so far. This last thread that we've been on really highlights for me, I think, one of the core concepts that are sort of at the foundation of this entire discussion, which is the distinction between personality types or traits or attributes and skills. And what I'm hearing is that what we're talking about is a set of skills or behaviors that can be practiced or ways of thinking that can be developed intentionally over time, irrespective of what you feel your underlying personality type or natural way of being is. And to that end, Dr. Loscalzo, can you tell us about whether medical training programs are teaching these skills intentionally?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I second your description of the pause that people have about personality is your perceived way that you like to interpret the world, that you like to enact it with it. But EI, I believe, is more malleable than that. It's a behavior. It's a skill. It can be practiced. It can be developed. The same way that you develop skills around procedurally placing a central line, and you practice your ultrasound skills, you practice your needle control, you can practice communication skills. You can practice and develop these. And I really believe that that can happen independent of personality, even though it may be influenced by it. So, does this happen? I think it does, but I should add some qualifiers to that. Many of us have been exposed to at different points during either medical school, residency, or fellowship, communication workshops, or difficult conversation workshop, or things like doctoring, professionalism, these different titles where you are likely covering concepts in emotional intelligence, but maybe with not that label attached to it. So I think that this happens formally. I also think much, much more of it happens informally. That is, you live an experience for better or for worse, and you learn from it. And you say, wow, that went really well in terms of that interaction with a family member or with a nurse or with a colleague. Or that interaction went really poorly. Why did that go poorly? Or where did it deviate? Feedback that you do with your attendings or with your colleagues, it's often reflecting on behaviors and how you handled situations. Yes, there is discrete feedback about medical decision-making that happens, but I guarantee you're actually getting a lot of feedback about how you are managing, organizing, and leading as much as the actual decision-making that you are doing.
It seems like emotional intelligence fits into this, the softer skills, so to speak, of being a great clinician. Had the specifics of emotional intelligence actually been described, like the actual skills that we need to teach residents, fellow physicians, pediatric critical care? Like, do we know exactly what are the components that are important, or are we left with this overall idea of what emotional intelligence is?
Yes and no, unfortunately. So there has definitely been qualitative work that has been done where survey data from multidisciplinary teams, physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, to say, hey, what are important characteristics of leadership? And, this was done within pediatric critical care fellows, specifically even. And what rose to the top in terms of descriptions of quality leadership were things like effective communication and effective leadership and emotional intelligence. So they are recognized as important, but it's not clear that we have fully broken down what all the most valuable behaviors are. And more importantly, when is the right time to really focus and develop on those behaviors? As an example, within those domains of emotional intelligence we talked about, relationship management is one of those domains. Within there, there's a competency called positive outlook and another one called influence. Those are really big terms, and they are important. If you look around your divisions in the hospitals that you're at, I'm sure you can identify faculty members or even fellows or maybe even yourself they carry a positive outlook. They help to lead through adversity. They help to influence those around them. And how did they get there? Did they get there just from years of experience? Did they get there from dedicated training? And then you say, all right, well, if I want to develop that, is that something that I teach residents? Is that something I teach fellows? Is that something I teach at the faculty level? So figuring out not just what the behaviors are, but when the right time to develop them are and to focus attention to it is a challenge that we have within this space.
Especially expressing it as a residency competency or as one of your personal goals for your residency. Because you feel like you just do your shifts and you try and take good care of the patients and you go home. And if you're adding this secret second set of goals for leadership, that's unique, when maybe every doctor should be thinking about those things.
Would love to get practical and just unpack more about what you're doing at your institution to help your trainees develop these skills and maybe borrow some of those ideas for our own.
Yeah, we're running a pilot curriculum right now that's dedicated to developing emotional intelligence in our critical care fellows. So to get back to your last question, how do you figure out what to target and what to teach on? My fellowship project was in describing and characterizing emotional intelligence within providers. So we did, for our entire division of providers, that is the fellows and the faculty, we did 360 evaluations in emotional intelligence. That is, we contributed to each other, we did a self-evaluation, we had nurses contribute, we had some of our APPs contribute, and we got descriptions of the emotional intelligence behaviors by strengths and by areas for improvement for fellows, junior faculty, and senior faculty. And what we saw there was that there was actually differences in what was being practiced behaviorally between the groups. So, for example, fellows were really, really strong at things like organizational awareness, achievement orientation. They've aligned really well with who the fellows were and what their jobs are. And then as you looked at junior faculty, for example, they started to demonstrate, in addition to those previous strengths, things like coach and mentor being a strength that was demonstrated within our junior faculty. And as you kept moving up, they kept adding more and more strengths to things like influence and positive outlook and some of these other competencies. So when you come back to what do you teach? Well, do you teach to strengths? Do you teach to areas that need to be developed? Do you teach to what the next level up is demonstrating? It's difficult to parse some of that out. So what we've done is this. We said at the core of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. So we're going to cover self-awareness. And then we started to introduce different competencies that were both areas for improvement for the fellows and their strengths. So we could play off their strengths and then build up in other spaces. So the exercises in self-awareness, we hinted to them a little bit, really describing these constructs of external and internal components to self-awareness, putting people into iterative scenarios and asking them to reflect and describe how they think they saw themselves and how others saw them. We've done very deep sessions that have led to descriptions of professional personal statements or professional mission statements through reflection, so that we really get our fellows describing, hey, this is who I am, this is what I value, and this is what I'm good at. Because I want you to know what you're good at and leverage your strengths in the clinical care environment. And looking forward, we're going to be doing sessions on things like conflict resolution. So for that session, as a very specific example, we're going to be doing a brief tool that helps to describe your preferred method of conflict resolution. Whether that is you flex to authoritarian, you always tell people what to do, whether you compromise a lot. And using that, we're going to, again, come up with some scenarios and do descriptions and reflections to say, hey, what do I use the most? When are the advantages of that type? What are the disadvantages of that type? And what is another complementary strategy that I should try to practice? And that's the big part of it. A lot of the sessions, what we try to leave with is really a behavioral toolkit. I am going to try to do blank when I am in blank situation. And the more specific we can be about it, the better. But that's just a brief description of some of the work that we are doing in the scope of this curriculum. And it's a combination of in-person didactics, reflective exercises, and then longitudinal learning with goal-directed components that are shared back within small faculty groups or with their clinical mentors.
This is incredible.
As I hear you talk, it strikes me that you and your group are sort of at the leading edge, if you will, of thinking about how to formally incorporate these concepts into a pediatric critical care curriculum. It sounds like there's not an established playbook for what steps you should be taking as you build this stuff out. Can you just talk more about that experience and on how you're figuring out where to take your next step as you're inventing this process?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in two parts. The first is, there are other disciplines in the world that pay a lot of attention to this. And if you flip over to the business world, for an example, there are really comprehensive career development and professional development platforms within the business world that really hone in on things like developing their next executive leaders and building them out. There's formalized training in the form of like MBA programs or Masters of Leadership Organization that spend a lot of time focusing and developing on this. And then in medicine, sometimes it feels like we're lagging behind a little bit what else is happening. But we have so many other responsibilities to it. So we here are doing a combination of our ongoing needs assessment to say, where do we think our strengths and weaknesses are? We're using external tools and evaluations to validate that. We're pulling from the business world in terms of ways that they practice and develop it. And we are willing to constantly look back and say, hey, that worked or that did not work. And we have to approach it again. And we're doing that with our fellows. So a big part of what I do is a lot of feedback with them about, hey, was that session what you needed? Do you see it as valuable? And how could we improve that going forward? So I think that there's a lot for us to learn from elsewhere. Medicine is not void of research into leadership. What we found is that when you are trying to study concepts like leadership, getting measurable outcomes is really hard. How do you qualify or quantify, for that matter, that someone is a good leader? If you have the answer to that, please share it back with me now, because it's really hard to do that. But what we know from medical education leadership and others is that the training in this needs to be dynamic. It needs to be multimodal, and it needs to be longitudinal, and ideally delivered in what's described as a spiral curriculum, which is you take a concept, and let's go back to, since we've talked about a couple times, the self-awareness concept. So your description for the three of you of who you were as a first-year fellow is probably different than who you are as a second-year fellow, is definitely different than who you are as a third-year fellow. And that's not just the way you see you, that's the way that others see you as well. So that recognition that the skills and the training has to evolve with the experience of the learner, that's a really important part of leadership.
Yeah.
That's such a powerful way to think about the self-reflection, but then also what's possible for people training fellows or people leading faculty groups. If I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, okay, I haven't had this secret leader curriculum for myself, but I would give myself a B+, B+ in this area, and I wanted to DIY some self-improvement at home. Where do people start? Where do they start self-reflecting? What do they start reading? What resources should they use?
For those who are motivated to DIY, you should know how you learn. So I say that because DIY may not be able to be done by you yourself, Alice. You may only be able to reflect in the mirror, as you're standing there practicing your verbiage to yourself.
And we're not doing a solo 360, okay? That's too much. That comes across weird.
I think an exercise that is easily done that I would encourage all fellows to think about is, what are, at this moment, your goals? That is, for where you are in your career and your others, what are your physical goals? And if you ask fellows right now, many of them may have project-specific goals related to their research, procedural skill goals. They may have a content area that they want to develop more, want to get much better at my point-of-care ultrasound assessment and shock, or I need to develop and practice my delivery of care for acute TBI in that first 12 hours. Those are really specific goals. But I challenge the fellows, or anyone else who is listening, create for yourself a leadership-specific goal. Figure out what aspect of leadership you want to focus on. And it can be big, it can be small, but that first step of saying, I'm going to identify and name an area of personal improvement, that's tangible, that's operational, and you don't need a big infrastructure to do that. Because if you take that and you start to share that with your mentors around you, with program directors, with program leadership, you're going to find that there are people who are willing to reflect on that with you, and that leads to iterative growth.
What would an example of some of those goals be?
Yeah, I can share. I had a sit-down session recently with someone and we were talking about communication with our nursing colleagues in particular. And the conversation was great. And this is a very motivated individual. And they said, I engage with the nurse on every single rounds. And at the end of rounds, I ask them if they have any problems or any concerns or any questions. And I said, great. Is that working? And there was a pause, and then there was a longer pause, and the response was, I don't know. Is it working? I said, well, if you're identifying it as something that you're trying to develop, maybe we just need to reflect on the way at which you are practicing this. So the specific goal was to enhance communication with the bedside nurse. And the action or the behavior that we created was that opening dialogue with more open-ended questions may actually leave a lot of nurses to respond as, I'm okay. But if you ask them a more targeted question about their concerns about the stool frequency over the last 12 hours, or if they have any specific things like that, you may find that the nurses will volunteer more information to you than when you were leaving too broad of questions. So we left that discussion with a very tangible behavioral modification, which was trying to complement the open-ended question of anything else you're worried about to something that that fellow thought was important to the clinical care of that patient. And not in a way that put the nurse on the spot or other, but probed so they could volunteer more and be more engaged in the discussion.
That makes sense. It's almost like he was giving the nurse a bit of an idea what he was searching for, but also keeping his question open where he or she could list whatever concerns they had.
Yeah, and this is a very, very specific example, but this is how you have to look at emotional intelligence, is that you have to pick out behaviors. And you have to really be willing to target and develop your actions and your modulation around those behaviors.
Yeah.
What you're saying is you're framing skill development in this domain in the context of the way that we approach skill development generally in critical care training, which is to say, here's a concrete behavior or a concrete area in which I'm trying to improve. Let me figure out what I'm doing when it comes to resuscitation or central line placement or when to use this or that biologic. Let me form a specific development goal around that and pay attention to that myself, but also ask people around me to pay attention to how I'm doing so that together we can reflect and hopefully I can grow. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We are just extending that same practice to another set of behaviors here in this emotional intelligence category.
Yeah, and I have a lot of faith in critical care physicians and fellows as learners. And I also recognize, just as you said, you have been exposed to the same cognitive framework for learning for 8+ years. So you have to be careful not to completely reinvent it, or you will lose people along that path.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I have a couple quick follow-up questions.
Yeah.
One, I'm jealous for this 360 evaluation that you've implemented, and I'm jealous and envious for the information that your trainees are learning about themselves and how to improve the care that they deliver. I imagine that can be a really humbling experience at first, but certainly very helpful. I'm curious, how did you get the buy-in from the nursing staff, APPs, attendings, the time in the curriculum? How did you get all those precious resources to get something like this off the ground?
Yeah. I think here at CHOP, I benefited that when I rolled this out, I was a fellow. And there is genuinely often a lot of support for fellow-level projects. Mm-hmm. So I think I have to add that disclaimer that, hey, this is what I want to study. This is why you care about this. We are going to try to characterize the emotional intelligence and the behaviors to help make us better, to help make our practice better, our culture better. And with the frame of improvement, it's really hard to find someone who you're like, I want to make life for you at the hospital better. And they're like, no, I'd rather not. And, it was an ask for these 360 evaluations that we do for the buy-in piece. I'm asking when we do it, the evaluations take maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And we ask whether it's a faculty member or nurse to do 1 to 2 of them, but you're asking for 30 minutes of people's time, which I think if you give them ample framing for the importance, you give them follow-up of the results in broad descriptions, you let them know that it is valuable and that it's moving the needle on things, that's what people look for. They want to know that if I give you the time, that it's not time wasted.
Yes. And then my second follow-up question really centers around how emotional intelligence can inform how we communicate on rounds. Early in my training, I feel like I was just learning, how do you treat sepsis? How do you treat respiratory failure? And as I be the leader on rounds and work through discussing cases with residents and APPs, a goal of mine is to further empower residents and APPs, and let's use their plan as long as it's safe. I got 2 questions for you. One, how can I sharpen my emotional intelligence when I need to correct a resident or APP thinking their plan is not feasible? How can I, in a very emotionally intelligent way, redirect the care that direct way? And then the follow-up question would be, how can I align with a plan that maybe is not my own, but it would be safe for a patient?
Yeah, this is a great question because we're kind of straddling that, all right, we were just talking about all these leadership concepts and these other pieces, and now we're taking it to the bedside to say, I can see where this skill set would be valuable, but how do I operationalize it very discreetly? So I can give you an answer. It will be an answer that describes a way to approach it that maintains engagement. I can't say that it is absolutely the only nor the right way to do it, but in those episodes, what I will first say is that you, by identifying that's something that you want to work on, will already be listening to what is said differently than if you were just to say a first-year fellow in your training and you're so focused on the right answer and your answer. So you are already a couple of steps down the road for that. A strategy that I love to use in that scenario is, so this is your plan. So tell me a little bit more about what this plan will look like if your decisions are right. And maybe more importantly, tell me a little bit more about what this plan will look like if your decisions are wrong. And I may not use wrong depending on who's around or what the other pieces are, but asking that learner to take ownership for the anticipation piece. You're not making a decision for them. You're just asking them to weigh it out a little bit more, and then you have the opportunity to either add your clinical knowledge, tailor the plan a little bit more, or get to a point of reflection, say, well, what about this? You may not have thought about your titration on the ventilator, where you're going to wean the respiratory rate in your patient who's heavily sedated. That may not work the way that you want it to. And so you can add context. I really like adding anticipation to my clinical teaching as a way to kind of navigate that and still provide the autonomy. And I try to do it in a way that demonstrates to them that I care about your thought process. I am engaged and I'm here and I'm empathetic to your thought process. I'm open and we are connecting, and I'm here to support you in how to make this decision in the right way.
I really like that. Almost exploring, this patient with a rising BUN and creatinine who's -2 liters. Are you sure you want to give more diuretics? What would make you perhaps not give more diuretic? And perhaps maybe lead that learner to arriving at the safe and correct, somewhat correct decision.
Yeah, we've straddled a little bit into the medical education realm on this, but this awareness of yourself as the leader of rounds and the leader of decision making, you can very easily just say, no, we're not doing that. The kidneys won't tolerate it. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't help the team the same way that exploration does. It does not take that much more time to do these brief explorations. And I can tell you that it absolutely contributes to a more shared mindset around decision making.
Mm-hmm. As you talk about this, it's clear that you've thought a lot about these concepts and that you're working hard to integrate them into your leadership of the fellowship as well as into your clinical teaching day-to-day on rounds. The question for you that I have now is, what about faculty who have not been exposed to these concepts or who didn't have this as a part of their training? How are they supposed to teach fellows emotional intelligence competencies in the way that you described if they themselves haven't had that as a part of their training?
Yeah, that's hard. How can you ask someone to teach something that they don't have a construct for? That's probably an unfair ask of them. So I do believe that this type of training, this is important for our discipline. I can say for medicine as a whole, it's important. I'll stay targeted to our critical care space specifically and say, this responsibility to be aware and to develop and grow, it's not just a resident or a fellow, but it's a faculty responsibility also. So I think that there is space for faculty to be exposed to these concepts, to learn about them, and therefore to be shared models around this across all levels. And if you introduce these constructs, we can talk about, we've come back to self-awareness a lot, we can talk about that and introduce it to faculty, and they can share their own perspectives on that, which are immensely valuable, but using the same language so that there's universal syntax for communicating. So I would say faculty absolutely can, but it does require some alignment so that you're speaking around the right topics in the right language.
Well, Dr. Stephen Loscalzo, this has been a fantastic conversation. As we wrap this up, what main points do you want our listeners to take away?
Emotional intelligence is ubiquitous. It is everywhere in the unit. I just want to call attention to that. It is not just the difficult near end of life or difficult decision-making family meetings. It is handoff to your co-fellow in the morning who is tired. It is your frustration that an attending is not listening to you. It is recognizing that the nurse may not have heard what you said in terms of what to anticipate. It's outside the clinical space. It's your research teams. It's your research projects. It's at home. It's such a ubiquitous entity that deserves some dedicated attention. And I think that we can do in medicine a little bit better than just relying on experiential learning to develop this in people. And that's my hope, is that discrete conversations like this, curriculums that we're piloting and trying to develop, they can introduce these topics in digestible formats that can help us grow, and grow maybe a little bit faster than we would if we relied on experience alone. That's what keeps me moving forward in this space.
Yes, well, we so much appreciate your time sharing it with us today. We are so excited to share this message with our listeners.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Peds Crit. Please remember that all content during this episode is intended for informational and educational purposes only. It should not be used as a replacement for medical advice. It's also worth noting that the views expressed during this episode by me, Zach, and our guests are our own and do not reflect the official position of our institutions. If you have any comments, suggestions, or feedback, you can email us at pedscritpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to help support the production of Peds Crit, you can find us on Venmo and Patreon. We've also had some light merch made in the form of Peds Crit laptop stickers, and if you include a mailing address with any contribution, we would be so excited to send you one. Thank you again for listening.
It took every fiber of my being to resist making a Philadelphia comment on trust the process. But I just kept saying to myself, that's too niche for the audience. Not everyone is a Sixers fan. For those that
those who are listening will get it. That's what you have to do. Just a little subliminal.
It's an Easter egg.